The Vietnam War is an amazing phenomenon. The expression itself has become a universal and almost the main meme on the planet. But at the same time, can I tell you about the origin of the conflict, what both sides wanted, and how it eventually ended? Don't worry, we'll explain everything for you in the next couple of minutes, and you'll know the meaning of Johnny, there in the trees. You will meet charming Viet Cong and become an expert in any dispute. Don't get distracted. To get started, let's take a look at Vietnam on the map again. This is an elongated country located under China and next to Thailand, the Philippines, and other popular resort destinations. These people were never bored, even without the Americans. In the 1,000-year history of Vietnam, one can count on the fingers the days when peace reigned there. However, in 1857, France decided that the Vietnamese were not democratic enough, and after a long war turned the country into its colony. This continued until the end of World War II. It is important to note that since 1860, there has been a powerful independence movement in Vietnam, and 1941 can be considered the actual beginning of the Vietnam War. Why was the Viet Minh, an organization led by Ho Chi Minh that sought independence, officially formed at that time? At that time, on paper, Vietnam was still a French colony, but in fact it was completely occupied by Japan. After all, the Second World War was in the yard, which could not be forgotten, and a rather interesting situation arose. On the one hand, Vietnam fought against the French colonial army, destroying it, and on the other hand, it was under attack by the Japanese. Thus, in fact, in the Second World War, Vietnam opposed everyone. This, however, did not stop the President of the United States from calling Ho Chi Minh hero 20 years before he became their main enemy in 1945, when Japan left the Viet Minh and they were left with only one enemy. The Vietnam War of Independence against France and a small British expeditionary force is often referred to as the First Indo-Chinese War. However, to be honest, it was a long and protracted conflict. This is where American soldiers entered the scene. Why? Because the Viet Minh mentioned earlier was completely socialist. On September 2, 1945, they declared independence and the establishment of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which was communist on paper. The emergence of a powerful socialist camp did not suit the Americans, so they actively supported the French with advisors, funding, and, of course, ammunition. The famous smell of napalm in the morning was first felt not by American soldiers, but by French soldiers. From 1945 to 1954, the French tried to maintain control over the colony, and already 10 years before the full-scale intervention of the United States, they were paying for 80% of the war. Roughly speaking, the Americans fought on the side of the French, who, unfortunately, fought the war very ineptly and eventually were defeated. Although, it would seem, against the 115,000 well-equipped French Corps, possessing tanks, aircraft, and napalm, the Allies acted with a force of less than 100,000 Vietnamese, who could not be called a full-fledged army. Until 1954, the Viet Minh never received a single tank or ship, but still won. As a result of an agreement made according to Korean drawings, Vietnam was divided into two parts. The northern part covered the territory up to the 17th parallel and was under the control of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. At the same time, the southern part remained under the control of the French, but this state did not last long. Here we come to the key point of the war, and it is that, unlike the Koreans, the Vietnamese wanted unity and did not want to be divided into two separate countries. The guys demanded the holding of elections, which, according to promises, were to be held in 1956. But, of course, this did not happen. The US was extremely concerned about the communist threat that had infiltrated Vietnam. The main political force in the country was the Communists, and the founder of Ho Chi Minh became president. In the northern part of the country, repressions, executions, and other negative aspects associated with communism began, which were accompanied around the world. According to various estimates, the Viet Minh lost from 5% to half of their own population, using fictitious pretexts to destroy the opposition. However, he had support even in the south, especially in rural South Vietnam as early as 1957. Consistently, communist uprisings began to emerge, which became the driving and most terrible force of hostilities. For generations, the guys fought either with neighboring countries, or with the French, or with the Chinese. China, by the way, was in a race with the USSR for influence on the communist camp in Vietnam, and in general it can be said that it won this race. However, in terms of global politics, both countries stood against the US and gradually began to supply North Vietnam with tanks, weapons, and specialists. This is what helped the Democratic Republic of Vietnam to become so strong that the communists began to seek to conquer South Vietnam, where they were supported, not only for ideological reasons, but also because the people of South Vietnam felt like a colony of the United States and its allies. Unlike South Korea, which dutifully succumbed to the victors, the Vietnamese on both sides sought independence. Because of this, the government of South Vietnam could not cope with the uprisings on its own. From the beginning of 1961, the United States began to transfer troops to Vietnam, and 1965 is considered the beginning of full-fledged military operations by the regular American Army. This year was also the start of a war that the U.S. lost humiliatingly. General Norman Schwarzkopf calls this a mistake. Indeed, the Vietnamese were united. As we have repeatedly mentioned, the situation in the country was initially considered a civil war, but after the intervention of the Americans, many South Vietnamese fled north and joined the guerrilla movement, fighting against the United States. As a result, more than two-thirds of the country, not just half, turned against the Americans. 2.5 million American soldiers passed through Vietnam, of which almost 60,000 died, and more than 300,000 were wounded. In 1968, there were 550,000 soldiers in the country at the same time, and the average age of the dead was 23 years and 11 months. This situation arose despite the fact that the American Army was considered the most powerful on the planet. It all happened because General Norman Schwarzkopf was right about the South Vietnamese National Liberation Front, better known as the Viet Cong. It was not a classic army formation, but a grouping of about 100,000 U.S. partisans, and William Westmoreland was the commander-in-chief. During the war, the search and destroy doctrine was applied, which involved the active use of reconnaissance and the destruction of enemy forces, as is usually the case in classical warfare. However, the problem arose that there were actually no enemy forces in the form of a regular Viet Cong army and an army of North Vietnam. For a long time, these Vietnamese forces used terror tactics, and the American military police recorded more than 1,000 terrorist attacks every month from the 60s to the 70s. In parallel with this, small detachments of the Vietnamese were almost everywhere. They used tunnels hidden in trees and slept in the mountains. After all, dense jungles prevailed in Vietnam, which made it easier to hide. The Americans planned to fight the regular army, but they made a mistake, getting thousands of guerrilla forces instead. They waged war with every available force, from Japanese World War II rifles to captured German weapons. Thanks to the excellent knowledge of the area and the unbending desire for independence, the Vietnamese performed real miracles. For example, look at the use of bombs. During the entire Second World War, the Allies dropped 2,700,000 tons of bombs on Germany. Do you know how much the US dropped on Vietnam in less than 10 years? 6,727,000 tons, almost 3 times more. However, the result was zero, as the search and destroy strategy completely failed, and the situation only worsened over time. North Vietnam began to aid the Viet Cong by providing them with weapons through the trails through neighboring Laos. Along with this, the Viet Cong received equipment from the Soviet Union, China, and other countries. According to experts, it was the supply of Soviet anti-aircraft systems, starting with the S-75, that played an important role in the course of the war, since they effectively countered American aircraft. Already in 1969, the United States realized its mistakes and began to gradually withdraw its troops. There were many reasons for this decision. First, military progress made it impossible to estimate the exact number of Viet Cong and their location. Secondly, it became clear to the Americans that interference in the affairs of Vietnam causes rejection by the local population. The U.S. decided to turn its attention to supporting the South Vietnamese Army, which was under their control. And thirdly, the American Army has lost combat capability. In 1970, 1 in 5 U.S. troops stationed in Vietnam used drugs, about 65,000 out of a total of 335,000. This was a serious problem. Every day the soldiers woke up, not knowing if they would make it to dinner, as 1 in 10 died. Endless bombardments, explosions, and terrorist attacks exhausted everyone. In fact, there was no end in sight to the war, and the Americans emerged from it as defeated. Although at the time of 1972 the Communists controlled only 10% of southern Vietnam. In 1973, a peace agreement was concluded, in which one of the conditions was the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops from the region. As soon as the Americans withdrew their troops, the Viet Cong and the Communist Army launched an offensive. Progress on the offensive was uneven, but without American support, South Vietnam found itself in a quandary. On April 30, 1975, the Communists raised the banner of independence in a palace in Saigon, announcing the official victory of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Despite the fact that the whole world was against it, with the exception of the United States, South Vietnam received support from South Korea, Australia, Japan, Taiwan, and other countries. However, it should be noted that the Viet Cong themselves received active support from socialist countries, including the USSR, Soviet divisions, and pilots who fought under the guise of Vietnamese forces. All this testifies to the wide scale of the involvement of various parties in the conflict. The Americans were defeated in this war, as their intervention and withdrawal of troops became the key points of defeat. These events remain shameful pages in the history of the U.S. Army. This is another example of how the big powers played war on foreign territory. What began as a civil conflict in a single country has grown into a mini-world war involving a dozen countries. According to the most conservative estimates, this war claimed 5 million lives, mostly among civilians. Civilians who do not distinguish between communists and capitalists and simply want to live in peace have become victims of these global conflicts. Modern history, including the experience of Vietnam, shows that the planet has failed to learn any lessons from this experience. Until we meet again, friends.